We're going to begin this tour through all of the tools and features of Lightwave 2017's renderer by looking at the absolute beginning of it, which is this, the color space options. It's important to tackle this as the first step because if you go wrong here, all of your renders will come out with certain problems in terms of their color, brightness, contrast, and so on. Now, first off, let me say this. There are some folk who are not so sure about the whole colour workflow and linear here and sRGB there, and they're not entirely certain of it. If you're such a folk, if you don't want to go in depth, then here's the catch-all trick. You come to presets, you set it to sRGB, and you're done. That's it. If you're quite happy, you can stop the video at this point. That really is all you need to know. However, if you want to know more, keep watching. The point behind having your colour space options is that images can be stored and of course rendered in a variety of different colour spaces. That is to say, there is a correction curve that gets applied to images, and this changes their brightness and contrast, how they appear on screen. Now, generally, when we see images on screen, they are in a colour space or a gamma space that's known as 2.2 gamma or sRGB, standard RGB colour space. This makes their brightness and their tonality and their contrast look normal on computer screens. However, the most natural method for a computer to handle colour information is in a format called linear. I say that there's a gamma curve that gets applied to images. Well, linear is a straight line. There is no curve. You can have a look online, Google around, discover how that works under the hood. To be perfectly honest, it's not that important to know. All that is important to know is that there are these different colour spaces that images can be both stored in and displayed in. So why this setting for sRGB by default? Well, for the most part, the vast majority of you, the monitor you are looking at is going to be in sRGB. That will be the colour space that it's using to display the images you see. Some monitors, it's entirely possible, might in fact be in Rec 709. This is a broadcast colour space standard. Give it a Google, look it up on Wikipedia. You will find that there are some monitors that conform to it, or have the option to display their colours in it. Normally, if you have such a monitor, you've probably bought it specifically because it does Rec 709. So if you don't know one way or the other, that's another reason to stick with sRGB. So that's display. Let's talk about image creation, because when things are rendered inside of the render engine, because the most natural representation of colour for a computer system is linear, all of the rendering gets done in linear. That means that when Lightwave is set to render an image, it is expecting that all of the colour information in there, all of the picked colours, all of the textures and so on, are in the linear format. And it performs all of its calculations in a linear space. When it's done with that, when it's done rendering, the image that it spits out, or at least the data of the image it spits out, is initially linear. Of course, when it throws that up onto your display at the end of the render, then it needs to convert it into the correct format to be seen on your display. So here, in short, is the idea of the colour space pipeline. You will have textures or perhaps picked colours that you will be viewing on your screen when creating them or choosing them in sRGB space. Once they go into the renderer, you want those converted to be linear so that the renderer can work on linear colours. It will perform its rendering, and when it's done, it will deliver a final image that is also linear. That image then, to be displayed or, used in the following steps, will want to be back in your screen space, or sRGB, gamma 2.2. Now, how all of these conversion steps get done along the way are what the options in the colour space dialog are for. For instance, you could create your textures in something like Photoshop, and you could manually convert them to linear and then give them to Lightwave. Let it do its rendering. You could take a linear file from Lightwave, bring it back into Photoshop or whatever else you were going to post-process it with, and then manually turn it back into sRGB. However, when you use the colour space workflow that's built into Lightwave, you can just work in sRGB all the time. You paint your textures in sRGB using whatever. You give those to Lightwave, it automatically converts them internally into linear space for its own workings. It works on them all. It delivers up a linear image, and then it converts it back for you so that the image you get out is back to sRGB. And so you see, that is what we see here in the options. Your picked colours wish to be linear. Light colours, which are just another picked colour, wish to be linear. Palette and 8-bit files, these are just normal image files that you would have, that you might have created with Photoshop or grabbed off of Google or whatever else. They will almost always be in sRGB format. So Lightwave knows that when it gets such an image, when it is having such an image loaded, it is in sRGB, and thus it is required to convert it internally. Float files. These are normally high dynamic range files, such as HDRs and EXRs. These can be stored in sRGB colour. Usually they should be stored as linear colour. As such, when you're downloading HDRI environments to use for global illumination and the like, you should expect them to be linear. And they certainly will be if they've been prepared properly. Alpha files, when they're loaded in, we look at those, black and white alpha file. Technically, that should be linear, and any properly prepared alpha file should come in as linear. So these are the conversion options for all inputs. It will always convert an incoming file to linear, and here is where you tell it what those incoming files have been stored as. Then, after that stage, Lightwave does all of its work, it does all of its rendering, and it spits an image back out at you. Of course, the image that comes out of the Lightwave renderer is linear, and so it now has to apply a colour space for you. So it asks you, what is your display? Well, normally that's going to be sRGB. Might occasionally be Rec 709. Also, of course, if you've got a display that has a specific colour profile, then you can always load an LUT if you have one available for your monitor. Default final render. When you save a file after having been rendered, it doesn't save just in whatever your screen colour space is. It can save into a different colour space, and this is where you tell Lightwave to make that conversion correct for saving. Now the final render is the final render. It's the entire image, and most of the time you would want, providing that you're working in sRGB, you would want that to be saved as sRGB. Therefore, the file on your disk, when you open it in Photoshop or ImageView or whatever else, will be in the sRGB format. Default buffer. Now, your image, whilst you've got the final render, which is your complete image, Lightwave can also output buffer files. These are components of the image, the diffuse, the specular, and a whole range of other component parts that make up the image. It is essentially the final render split into different pieces. Now you'll notice that by default that is set to linear. There is a reason for this. So here we see a render in Photoshop, and you can see that at the top here I have final render, and this is basically what all of the buffers look like combined together. As it happens, I have that in linear, but ordinarily you would have exported that in sRGB. If we turn that off, then we can see all of these layers beneath it, and what these are the component parts. So that's the luminosity there, this is some of the specular, this is other elements of the specular. We have indirect lighting, so that's from global illumination. We have the direct lighting component, and when you stack all of these together and you add them up, what you get is the final render. Now here's the thing, when you add buffers together like this, look at the mode by which they are being put together. Every single one has the transfer mode add, or linear dodge as it's called here in Photoshop. Adding colours together is an operation that requires those colours to have linear gamma. As we said before, the most natural way for a computer to understand colour internally in terms of data is in a linear colour profile. This is because of the way that mathematical operations on colours are carried out, and for colours to properly sum together, they need to be linear. If all of these buffers here were saved as sRGB, using add would not work correctly. There is a mode in Photoshop which has been here for donkey's years, called screen. Perhaps you've used it. This is where you put one image on top of another and the bright areas from the top image get projected onto the lower image. The old saying is it's been like if you have a painting that you're using as a screen and a projector that projects an image on top of that. That is what screen mode is. Really, screen was a sort of a dodge to try and get an add mode that worked with sRGB. It's not quite correct. It is close, but it's not quite correct. As such, if you do save your buffers as sRGB and you want to add them together, you will need to use the screen mode. But do be aware, you will wind up with a slightly different result than your final render looked in Lightwave. Otherwise, you render all of your buffers as linear, you set them to add, and you get your proper final render. Once done, of course, if you remember the graphic about the whole gamma space workflow, you then need to apply a gamma correction, which you can see I've done here at 2.2. If we turn that off, then this is what the image looks like at gamma 1.0. All of this stuff here is linear, and of course my final render you see there is also presently linear, but when we apply the gamma correction, then it is in sRGB. So that is why by default your buffers are set to save as linear. Lastly, the alpha channel. Again, alpha channels should always be linear because they cut pixels in and out, or rather they fade them. And when compositing images together with alpha channel, that is a linear operation. Why? Because like the add, alpha is a multiply operation, and the computer expects to do that in linear space. Perhaps you've tried compositing images together with alpha channels in the past, and you've had that strange sort of thing where you get a little halo around the edge of the part that's being cut out with the alpha. That's the fault of not having a proper linear alpha that is correctly pre-multiplied. The value of the multiplication at those very edge pixels is slightly wrong. So the last bits here then, auto sense on load, just auto senses what type of color space is in a given image when you load it. Color correct OpenGL, if you turn that off, then your color space of your OpenGL is linear. Of course, you want to correct that to display here. Should it not do that automatically when you've got display set to sRGB? No, it's changing the images that you see. When it displays an image in Image Viewer, then it will use the display space here. But if you want that applied to OpenGL, then you need color correct OpenGL turn. Affect color picker. Yes, you want that to happen if you've got picked colors set to linear so that the color you see is the color that gets picked. If you turn this off, then you click one color and you find that your image or whatever it is you've applied the color to, the light, comes out at a slightly different shade. And lastly, convert 8-bit to float. We're used to seeing images and colors displayed as values between 0 and 255. 256 different possible integer values for the red, green and blue. This is the 8-bit way of writing a color, 8-bit notation. Colors can of course be represented in other ways, and one of the more common is float. For instance, if I just come back here to the General tab of the Preferences, you can see that the color format has 3 options: integer, float or percentage. Let me just bring up my light properties here, and you can see that I've got the color options for the light, currently 255, 255, 255, which is white. If I set this to float, then it becomes 1.0, 1.0, 1.0. And so this is 1 times red, 1 times green, 1 times blue. This is now float color. What does it mean? Well, it means you can get a slightly different set of gradations between colors. Here I can also set it to percentage, which is kind of another way of doing float, except you just express it as a percentage rather than a single floating point number. So this option just takes files that are coming in normal 8-bit integer color files that have their colors listed as 0 to 255 and just converts them into the float format. Principally, this is invisible, but what it does allow you to do is to get slightly better color fidelity when you're manipulating the images in Lightwave itself. For instance, you might be doing surfacing and you're using an image and you wish to use it in a couple of different contexts, and you're wanting to shift the saturation or the contrast or something like that. Having the image converted over to float will make that operation cleaner. Let's just take a look at one or two other places where this colour space difference does sort of raise its head that you'll just want to be aware of. Firstly, here in the VPR menu, VPR, when it's running, can just save out an image directly via this little save icon, which will actually appear lit up when I am in VPR. That'll just save an image to disk when you set it here. You'll notice that it also has a colour space setting for how that image will be saved, both for its main colour and of course for its alpha channel. Make sure that you note this. There's nothing more annoying than having an image render up in VPR, doing a quick save out and then discovering that it's been saved in linear. Another place where you'll notice a difference is here in the node editor. Here I've just got a image on a plane. This isn't actually a render, it is just, let me show you swiftly, a plane here, simple flat plane polygon with an image texture map placed upon it. And you can see here in the image editor that the image appears color correct, and here in the image node options the image appears color correct, but here in the thumbnail preview of the node itself the image appears dark. Don't worry about this, it's just that these thumbnail previews aren't color corrected. So of course this is an 8-bit image, Lightwave is converting it to linear, and the image node preview here is just showing that linear version. You'll notice that if I just set the colour space for the image here to be linear, then now it looks correct over here, but of course it's blown out and too bright in both of these places. Why is it blown out and bright? Aren't linear images supposed to be dark? Yes, they are, but I've got my display set to sRGB, so it thinks that this image is darker, and hence it's applying brightening to it. Now this very simple setup here does of course show us the whole colour operation fully working. I've got an sRGB image that I've loaded in, it's been converted to linear, Lightwave has performed a render, it's spitting that image back out and converting it into sRGB for me to view here on screen. And of course I save that image in whichever colour space format I'm requiring. Let's just go a little bit further by having a look at a couple of less facile examples, and what we see here is I've just got a few balls on a plane and a couple of area lights. I've got this one area light here which is putting out a white colour, and this second area light off to the side here which is putting out a pink colour, which is why everything has this pink cast, and it all looks lovely and nicely rendered. If we go to our colour space though and we just disable everything so everything goes to linear, then you can see what we get. Everything gets a lot darker. But not only is it darker, it's more contrasty. If we look here at the area on the floor near the area light, we see that it's still very bright, but that brightness falls off very, very quickly as we go further out to the shadows. Of course, when we are properly in sRGB mode, then we have a nice smooth gradient of brightness that is falling off much more gradually and gives us a more pleasing and less contrasty, more balanced image. You see, this colour space isn't simply to do with when we are loading textures in. As I said, the render is taking place in linear space, and that needs to be properly converted for output. Lightwave needs to know what the colour space of your monitor and your output files and all of that are. If it doesn't and it applies no corrections, then what you wind up with are renders that look like this. So even if you don't use a single imported texture in your scene, if you are not using correct colour space, it's very hard to do good lighting. You wind up having to use loads of lights and turn them up really bright, and you wind up with renders that are very contrasty. In order for the render engine to give you proper, accurate results and nice, clean renders, you need for it to have the correct colour space setting. Here we see another situation where people often have problems if they're not using correct colour workflow, and that's rendering things in an HDRI environment, both for the lighting contribution and also the reflections. What we see I have here is I just have this environment of the Brooklyn Bridge as viewed from Manhattan here. Where is the bridge? There it is. And this environment is providing both lighting through global illumination for our items here, and of course it's also being reflected in our shiny little spheres. Now of course this is an HDRI, so the sky over there is exceedingly bright, whilst of course if we look here underneath the roadway at the parking area, then of course it's, you know, in shadow and it's much dimmer. But of course if we look at the way that the reflections are reflecting this environment, they are reflecting it all correctly. Similarly, of course, the amount of illumination that our scene is receiving is correct for the environment that it's in. You see the front face here of the elephant is lit up really quite brightly owing to the bright illumination on that side. Whereas if we turn around and take a look at his butt, for instance, then we can see that he's, you know, getting much darker illumination. The brightness and the colours are properly balanced to match the background itself. If we were to pop into the image editor, where of course we have this image loaded, now of course its RGB is set to default, which is linear because this is a high dynamic range file, this is a float file. You'll see that if we told it that this were sRGB, then the contrast all goes massively wrong. First, the sky is brighter than ever, and the underside here, where the parking area is darker than before. It's overly contrasted, and you can see the ugly lighting and reflections that we're getting. If we look at the reflection of the little gold spheres here in our main sphere, they look good, but then you see the underside of the roadway there, and that just doesn't seem to fit in at all, and neither does the bright sky. Similarly, if we come over to our presets and we just disable all colour management, then it goes the other way entirely, and we wind up with lighting that's just too dim for the environment. Again, the sky is still, as we can see there, exceedingly bright, and the under area is really quite dark, and the lighting of our items is just too dull for the amount of light in this scene. And again, we see that the reflections are overly contrasted. They don't really look that great, at least those of the environment. Whilst of course we see the golden spheres being reflected are of course picking up a darker reflection there. The lighting of our items and their reflections just don't seem to go together. They look misplaced against one another when done this way, and of course to the opposite degree when we changed the environment to say that it was sRGB, when indeed it should not be. If you're on the wrong side of the colour control, then things just will not match their environment, and they'll either all be too dark or all be too bright, and they just won't seem to marry up correctly. But if you have the right colour setup on, then they all seem to fit. The amount of illumination on our items here matches the sort of brightness that we're seeing in the backdrop, and the reflections of course look correct for what we're seeing. And so there we have it. That is the colour workflow system available in Lightwave. What it does, how it manages everything, and why it's important to have that set up correctly before we start making any materials or any renders, so that we can be sure we get the correct result out at the end. We also see, of course, that it doesn't have to be confusing, and you don't have to manage any of it yourself. And having seen how it all works and how all of the pieces need to line up, it really is, for almost everyone, just as simple as that we said at the beginning. Just go ahead, use the sRGB preset, and you will be good.